I'd like to say welcome to our special guest today, Jesse Ribot, and welcome to the audience, and that's both you here and those streaming. I'm Neil Webster. I'm a senior researcher at DIIS and currently coordinator of a research program called Governing Climate Mobility. And it's a research program we're undertaking with our partners in Ghana at the Center for Migration Studies and in Ethiopia at the Forum for Social Studies. And GCM, the program Governing Climate Mobility, is the kind of initiator for this meeting and for bringing Jesse here. Let me just present a little bit more on Jesse. I hope you don't mind. Jesse Ribot is a human geographer of environmental justice and rural well-being. I took that from your website. He studies the social and political economic causes of the precarity and suffering of nature resource-dependent communities. He conducts his research in 4 interlinked arenas: decentralization and democratic local government, natural resource tenure and access, distribution along natural resource commodity chains, and household vulnerability in the face of climate change. And he uses a political economy approach, drawing on disciplines of sociology, human geography, political science, political philosophy, and geography. Yeah, I think that covers the main areas as I understand it. And most of your research has been in West Africa, particularly in Senegal, but also in other areas in Asia and other parts of Africa. And he not only writes and publishes extensively, he also informed me yesterday has taken up ceramic. So I don't know if that will come into the presentation at all, but it has a symbolism under the COVID period, I was informed. Now, Jesse's bio in many ways serves as an introduction to this seminar. Climate Change, the title, I hope you liked it because it came from one of his reports several years ago. Climate change is not the cause, migration not the solution. The ethical issues in causality. Now, the GCM program, which I mentioned earlier, began in 2019 to question and challenge the tendency to do just that, to introduce causality from climate change to migration. We sought to challenge that in a number of ways. We began with the premise that government and other governance institutions play a critical role in shaping the space where decisions on mobility are taken. So here we were talking about slow onset climate change, changes in temperature, changes in rainfall patterns, changes in rainfall generally, the implications this has for crop diseases, for insects, etc., etc. What we were trying to introduce into this, shall we say, causality, was to ask, how do households adapt or not? How do governments respond or not? How do programs of donors and others facilitate ways to respond or not? And how do mobility practices enable adaptation or not? Now, our partners in Ghana and in Ethiopia, and we actually have some representatives from our partners in the audience today, special welcome to you. Our partners led the research in Ghana and Ethiopia, looking into the drivers of migration. I hate that term, drivers of migration, because it's the very thing we were trying to challenge a little bit. But the causes, and quickly it became very clear from the research that our partners were undertaking, was that it's much more complex, it's much more nuanced. It's a much richer landscape of action and non-actions by governance institutions, by households, and by individuals. Mobility practices clearly had long histories, but they also had new dynamics, and that was coming out of the field research which was being undertaken, fortunately, mainly just before COVID became the major challenge. Now, how to work with these findings, because those of us in the research program, we are human geographers, we're social anthropologists, we're sociologists, we're political economists. We were challenged because we were having to work together in new ways. We were having to shift our epistemic positions in communities quite a lot. We can also see that policymakers and practitioners, they're similarly challenged. That was becoming very clear from the research. Causal is simple. Simple is more containable, and changes thereby more doable. At least insofar as they do not challenge the ways that their institutions are structured, the kind of silos of government ministries, the ways that NGOs are focused on particular approaches in particular fields in particular ways. The ways that decisions are taken and the ways that resources are allocated, as long as these are not changed, then it's business as usual. It's little changes. Now, GCM inserts governance into the climate change mobility equation. And not just the institutions of governance, that's both formal and informal, both government institutions, traditional paramount chiefs, etc., but also the relations of governance, the relations between governed and governors, the relations of political authority, of accountability, of relations that influence whether one is represented and served or merely ruled over. Now, Jesse Ribot has worked with all three dimensions, climate, migration, and governance, for many years. And I'm particularly happy with his work on decentralization, which is my field. So and in many contexts, that's why we wanted him to come to DIIS, and that's why we're so happy that now that COVID is under control, he could come. After, the way we've organized this is that Jesse will present for about 35 minutes. There will then be a short break when you can refill your coffee cups and tea or whatever. Then we'll reconvene, and Nina and Lily will be up here, and they will come with comments, and then the floor is open. So, Jesse, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Neil, for a warm welcome. I'm really delighted to be here. I feel like Copenhagen is my 7th or 8th home. Now, I was going to say second, but I realized there are a lot other places that I've hung out, like Senegal and Washington and New York. But I feel very at home here and at ease to talk about things that I'm struggling with. As I present the material that I'm now working on, it's hard to shift from one piece of the analysis to another, but I'm going into a new piece of the analysis, which is on these questions of cause and responsibility. And I have what I call a problem-oriented approach. So when Neil was introducing the talk and DIIS, he said, how this and how that. But I think of problems as why. Why? Why do people need to migrate? Not how. Not how do we adapt, but why do we need to adapt? And that's important because there tends to be in international development a push toward how do we get this done way before asking why does it have to be done, what caused the problems we're in. So that's in a sense, the orientation I start with is the why. So the plan for the talk basically is that I'm going to introduce the case of Senegal really briefly. I'm going to talk then about causal models or frames of analysis of climate crisis. Okay, how does climate relate to crisis? And I'll look at it in a natural science or hazards framing, and in a social science or more vulnerability frame. I will then come back to the case of migration from Senegal toward Europe. I'll then return to the modeling bringing the case into the models, and I'll interrogate this question of cause and responsibility. In the end, pointing basically to the need for social causal models, more deeply social causal models, and to basically make a point, which is that we all come with models. Climate modelers come with models. Peasant farmers have their models. And we make decisions about which models we use, but we make those decisions in a context of structured social, political, economic realities. So the layer that I'm kind of still muddling around with in my head is, how do we deal with the causes of our decision concerning the models of analysis that we use? So that said, framing the case. I'll be looking a little bit at charcoal and cotton as sub-cases because there are many sectors in rural Senegal. There was a boat that sank off of Lampedusa on the 15th of April, the 19th of April 2015, with 729 migrants on it. And there were 29 survivors. It was the worst disaster in the Mediterranean since World War II, sinking of the Orissa. And the case was of interest to me because I was looking for a climate crisis case to study at the time. I was ready to go anywhere in the world to study why it happened and how people understood it. And this boat sank, and many of the migrants on it were from the villages I work in Senegal. And so I decided to go and interview their families, their friends, to understand why did they go. They were being called climate refugees by every journal you can imagine, New York Times and others, and international development agencies. So starting in the moment of departure, which is how I tend to work, progressive contextualization, parents and families would wake up in the morning and find their kid was gone and had gone with another couple of kids. And I say kids, okay, they're anywhere from 14 to 35 years old. And in Senegal, by the way, at least in this region, youth is up to the age of 50. So it's a pretty broad category. In any case, they would leave on their own, often against their parents' decisions, and many people called them climate refugees, but are they? What we have is that the biophysical reality is that in the Sahel, rainfall has become more variable and later rains. But rainfall has increased over the last 20 years. Crop trends are pretty constant. The hungry season is fairly constant. Rainfall and security are simply not correlated from place to place. And we are seeing what's called the greening of the Sahel. These are not quite conditions of climate change. In fact, I would say the only climate-related piece of the migration puzzle is that when there's a good harvest, people make more money that they can save, and they use that to migrate. So it's about better conditions, not worse. I mean, so it's really a complex situation in a lot of ways. This crisis is not a climate crisis in the way people are framing it, despite all the claims. So climate's not the problem. The farmers view it as normal background fluctuations, the situation. They're used to this. Production is up and down and as usual, and they see it as not in their control. So they don't view climate as a cause, partly because it's not something they have a say over, as it were. Climate change is not mentioned without me asking people about it, okay? Some have heard of it, they don't perceive it, and one who did hear of it did say to me, they told us things are going to get worse. And for him, this was like, you know, things are kind of bad, but not because of the weather. But if weather gets worse on top of this, that wasn't something he wanted to be hearing. So what we see when we analyze anything is shaped by our frames. Frames matter. And Sahelian migrants are called refugees or climate migrants, despite that they're not, and I think that's partly because of frames that are chosen. This is not just in the Sahel. In Brazil, there were mudslides in the mountains outside of, in the state of Rio, and politicians were claiming that they were climate change. Local people said, no way, these floods and these problems were based on your stinking policies. Okay, and by the way, climate modelers and climate scientists said the local people are right. These are not climate-related floods. Recent famine in Madagascar and the Horn of Africa has been blamed on climate change, and again, it does not look like there's even in climate science a justification for saying so. But it's politically expedient to say so because politicians like to say, happened from something that fell from the sky. Are these disasters caused by climate events? Why are they blamed on climate change? It's sort of obvious. Did these crises just fall from the sky, or were they made on the ground? That's the kind of question I'm trying to ask. And I think this is not just a climate change issue. The earthquake in Haiti, 200,000 people died from a 7.1 earthquake. San Francisco's earthquake was 7.1. I think it was 46 people died, 35 of whom died in the Cypress structure, which collapsed, which was not collapsing due to the earthquake. It was collapsing because everyone knew it was going to collapse in any earthquake, and the governor failed to repair it, one could say. And that's a long story, but an interesting one. COVID deaths are blamed on a virus. Well, to what degree are they about a virus? To what degree are they about histories of exclusions and access to transport that's safe and access to medical treatment and access to decent food, right? So obviously it goes beyond the climate. Are these losses attributable to nature or even to human influence? Nature, the answer, in my opinion, is yes, they are. And no, they are not. It depends on the frame you choose. It is a matter of choice, and it's a structured choice. We frame nature and the social in, or we frame nature and the social out, or the social out. And I think there are a couple of unasked questions that I'm beginning to poke around with, and that is, why do analysts choose the frames they choose, and what is the basis of that choice? And this gets in very uncomfortable territory, right? You're saying to natural scientists who are very attached to their models, oh, you're, choosing your models based on a set of normative criteria, et cetera, and they have really bad implications, your choices. So how do we frame cause? Typical analytic frame is risk, probability times consequence, an old engineering definition. Vulnerability, a predisposition to damage. Climate hazard is a weather-related stressor, event, or a trend. So climate hazard and vulnerability result in damage. Notice that's not plus or times, it's and. Because no hazard, there's no damage, even if there's a lot of vulnerability. No vulnerability, no damage, even if there's a lot of climate hazard. And the relation between them is a complex one. So the typical model that we get is the hazards model. And many of you, anyone in climate science knows of these models. They're linear causal models, basically saying that climate events are causal and mediated maybe by some photographic kind of snapshot social conditions that are taken as a given, cause a number of outcomes. So it's the multiple outcomes of a single event. And, natural scientists, or as I say, natural scientistical or computational models ignore social facts. And I wonder why. Natural scientists and economists do not have social science training. That's a kind of trivial piece of the puzzle. The social is held constant in these models, like, as I said, a snapshot. Social is not considered to have cause. That's even true in Amartya Sen's work as an economist. He takes entitlements, but he doesn't ask how people got them. They're a given, right? There's no causality. The political, economic, structural antecedents of inequality are not accounted for. And social is not considered more than the indicators of conditions that are found in place. Social cause can depend on things, though. This is another very interesting element of why natural scientists ignore the social. Social can be dependent on things that did not happen. Social contracts, laws, custom, convention, they establish expectations within which something not done can be seen as a cause. We have a word for it, negligence, right? Or turpitude. You can call it what you like. But that is not the case in the natural sciences. Things that didn't happen cannot be causes. Seems trivial, but it is a big difference between natural and social science. There's no mathematical way also of attributing proportionality among causes. Now, this is really important, and again, more than I can develop in its entirety, but the Groundswell report, a big UN, I think it was UNCDF. No, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of UNCDF from a conversation from yesterday. It was UNFCCC, was partly behind, looked at Latin American migration and basically said the climate change we've seen can account for 5% of the increase in migration toward the north. And there's no way, because it's entirely dependent on the vulnerability. So that climate change could have launched 10 times more people if there was high vulnerability, or no additional people if there was low vulnerability. And that kind of accounting is wrong-headed. The climate increment of a storm does not automatically, commutatively lead to outmigration in Honduras or anywhere else. No commutativity. That is super important because it is the assumption behind most climate models. Social cause is also contentious. It's ignored because it's contentious. Cause leads to blame, responsibility, points fingers, the whole thing. Institutions don't want to be indicated. The social also is problematic because for a climate modeler interested in bringing attention to climate change, it takes attention away from climate as cause, which can be important. Okay, so what are the alternative models? We started with the multiple outcomes of a single cause, and the alternative models are multiple problems, multiple causes, that is, of a single outcome. So you take an outcome like hunger or migration, and you say, how did this happen, right? And of course, climate becomes one amongst many causes, exactly what the climate modelers don't want, because part of their motive is to show, quite rightly so, that climate change is a big problem, and they should be doing that, right? But they should be specifying their assumptions in doing that, because we don't want to exclude these other causes. And Amartya Sen does the same thing in a more complex manner. Entitlement failures and lack of capacity, lack of assets, lack of social protections, but as I said, unexplained initial conditions, individualized action, and climate is kind of at the margins of this model as well. A broader political economy model, I'll just go to the next slide on that, but basically the poverty associated with outcomes is associated with lack of assets, lack of social protections, as Sen really beautifully informed us, but we talk about exploitation and relations, identities, expropriation, political exclusions. So we have to explain the initial conditions if we're explaining the causes of the vulnerabilities that lead to the damages that follow a climate event, right? Access relations. Those are the socially differentiated explanations of these particular elements. So we see political exclusion, but it's not uniform, right? And we can elaborate more and more, and I'm not going to, but just to say, again, climate in the corner of the model. So back to the Senegal case. Senegal is where I do my work, west coast of West Africa, westernmost tip. Tambacounda region is where I've done my fieldwork. This fieldwork was done with Papa Fai, and Matt Turner and I, and Papa also did some work in Niger, comparative work. It's a dry land area in the Sudano-Sahelian zone. And we did the typical kinds of methods, surveys, 1,000 households, about 100 in-depth interviews with repatriated migrants. We went back to the households as well in unusual cases. And we also talked to many of the local authorities. Bottom line, in this area, which was considered really not the source of migration from Senegal, 53% of the households had someone in the migration process. But I think the most important piece of this is 8% of all households surveyed. And by the way, we picked in the region 3 villages, one that people said had very low migration, one that they said had high migration, and one that they said was right in the middle. That, you know, that we think we got a pretty good sampling. 8% had someone who had left and was unaccounted for. 2% confirmed that someone had died. This migration is a problem, even if it's something people are choosing to do. Okay? It was much more damaging than we ever expected. So the Senegal story, why do farmers emigrate? What's their concerns? As mentioned, weather is not mentioned when not asked about. They do experience a pervasive subsistence crisis in which they're pretty much ratcheted down below subsistence in each of the sectors that are commonly part of rural livelihoods: peanuts, corn, millet, charcoal, cotton, skilled labor. And we'll look at charcoal and cotton in a little more detail. There's a problem of lack of services that people talk about. Agriculture, veterinarian, and medical services are free, but people have to pay market prices for them. The veterinarians, the doctors won't give services without getting paid, and people can't afford it. People in the villages I work in can't afford to get on the bus to go into the town to see the doctor, let alone pay medical fees. Declining family and community reciprocities was another issue. Moral economy breakdown, which basically I'll get into a little later. The social security relations are diminishing in various ways. Immigrants and remittances are causing another set of problems. Families with remittances are a different class than families without. It is causing a hierarchical relation in the villages that I'll also develop a little. Young men cannot come of age. They cannot find roles in the community or in the household. They are troubled because they can't get married. That's part of the story. And they're not getting married is partly because no family wants to marry their children off to somebody who does not have a migrant in the family who's sending remittances. So the boys from the families who don't have migrants are in trouble. And that's causing a whole secondary set of problems, because the girls in the families that do have migrants and who are getting married, they're being married off to migrants who are in Europe often, who are married to 3 young women in the village, or girls, 13, 14, 15 years old. And so their husbands aren't there. And what do you think a bunch of boys who can't get married, a bunch of girls without their husbands are doing? They're getting pregnant. And that is causing family breakdowns and fights across villages, across this category of migrant remittance families and non-migrant families. Precarity itself is a damage, and I want to point this out. We often say, oh, people are vulnerable to hunger and famine. They might be hungry and might have famine. The anxiety and precarity itself, before the damage ever happens, is itself already a damage. To speak to young people in this area who wake up and say, I don't know how I'm going to feed my mother today. It's not pretty. So there's also, lastly, a sense of disenfranchisement. No local and national representation. People do not feel they have an influence over those who govern them. A lot longer story, as Neil knows, in local government as well as national democracy. There are a lot of issues. Okay, so why young male farmers take the risk? Why do they go? By the way, they do know a lot about the potential damages in crossing the Sahara. They go, by the way, through, they go to Bamako usually, and from Bamako they go to Gao, and from Gao they cross into Algeria and then Libya, or they go through Ouagadougou and Niamey up through Agadez and up through the Iron Mountains and what have you, to Libya, and then they cross the Mediterranean if they can. Many of them don't. They get repatriated. So they talk about constant anxiety, seeking support to support family and self, no dignified roles or recognition at home. They'll tell you things like, I work like the family mule and nobody says thank you. That's a young man of 25 years old who didn't migrate, didn't marry, and is tending the animals, and, you know, it's not an obvious life in place. In families that do have migrants, the migrants are favored over the non-migrant kids. If there is a death in the family, if there is a problem in the family, the migrant in Europe could hear about it before the person in the household. And kids talked about this, said, my sister died and my brother was told before I even knew it, right? Because the brother in Europe could pay for the funeral. And girls married to migrants, non-migrant families feel subordinate to migrant families. So it is a new social structure in the area that's very different than when I first came and did my field work there 35 years ago. I've been back pretty much every year, and the sense of anxiety is palpable. I don't know that if that's because I've matured and could sense it, or if it really changed, but I believe it changed. By the way, this is also, it is important. The hungry season is no longer experienced by those with remittances, and migrant families are not participating in interaid. So the families getting remittances are told by those that give the remittances not to give the money away, and so they're not giving it away, and there's less interaid. That's part of the breakdown that we're seeing. Why young men take risks, slide 2, yes. God will protect me, alhamdulillah. That's, you know, people say as they leave that they are in the hands of God, and their parents and the imams are saying, no, God does not protect you from suicide. Suicide is not fate. Suicide is the denial of fate. And so there's a generational issue brewing around that, who, you know, takes which frame in terms of justifying a departure. Barça wala Barsak, Barcelona or death. Barcelona just means Europe, is something that they say when they're leaving. But I thought at first that meant, you know, I'm going to get to Barcelona, I'm going to get to Europe, or I'm going to die in the desert. And it didn't. Over and over again, I heard things like, here there is no life, right? And so what it was death in transit or social death if you stay home. And that, I think, is partly due to this breakdown in new class structure that young men in particular express these, and we focused on the young men because they were the only migrants. There were no young men, young women migrating. Some were going to the cities locally, but that was not our focus. We were looking at the trans-Saharan migration. So they attribute hopelessness to economic precarity, and in lots of interviews, 4 exclusions came up. Exclusion from resources, forests and pastures, markets, social services, representation. And these are complex exclusions that require a lot of attention to understand. But these result in a kind of anxiety. And they want, like anyone else, dignity. They want a well-paying job. Europe seems to be an option. They want to contribute. They want to be consulted at home and to have respect at home. That's why they leave. It's not like they're leaving to get away from home. They want to marry and come of age. And I've seen over and over again the just deep frustration of young people around that set of problems. So material deprivation and marginality are filtered through the above expressed expectations: marriage, job reciprocity, and feelings of marginalization, that is exclusion and disenfranchisement. So emigration is a decision, but it is a decision within a condition with political economic causes. Now, the case studies, which I have not gotten to, I'm going to go through in lightning speed. I just happen to like his shirt. This guy was one of the cotton farmers. Actually, he was a cotton farmer, but he was from one of the villages that was about a 15, 20-minute walk from where this was going on, because nobody would be harvesting cotton for somebody else in their own village, because it was not an act of dignity. They would go to another village to harvest cotton and get paid, because at home it was looked down on. And these are some cotton buyers. Happened to be 95 degrees. That's like, what, 37 degrees or something that day. So in cotton, what you have, talking about the exclusions, you have a monopoly buyer, fixed prices, debt on advances, collective debt on credit. I'm not going to develop the industrial subsidy by the peasant economy, but just to say the industrial production is more expensive because you have to pay wages. Therefore, they pay less to the peasants in order to subsidize and be able to sell the industrial cotton at a lower wage. Most farmers are in debt at the end of the season. That's the crux of the biscuit. Charcoal. A couple of charcoal makers. They're actually actors. This was a film I made. But charcoal for the city of Dakar. Again, fixed prices is an oligopsony, not a monopsony. Not a monopoly, that is. A group of buyers. The producers make about $1,000 a year, a subsistence wage. The merchants make between $10,000 and $500,000 a year. Some of them are making upward of $1 million US a year now in a little charcoal market for the city of Dakar. Okay, scientific forestry is used to tell local people who have the right to produce and to use the forest based on the decentralization laws, tells them you can't break a branch, that's deforestation, even though the law said it was their local representative that makes that decision. Scientific forestry took the right back. Recentralization in that sense. Access to markets is limited by permits, licenses, quotas allocated by the Forest Service. Access to credit is in the hands of the merchants, and therefore the price of charcoal is in what's called an interlocking credit labor market, where the price of charcoal clears due to the scarcity of loans rather than the relation between supply and demand for charcoal itself. And loans are pretty scarce. Access to representation is diminished by the fact that scientific forestry took forestry decisions out of the hands of local authorities. So the local authorities can't respond to people and represent them in these matters. The general case, what does Tambacounda access failure look like with all sectors included? It looks like a mess, right? But this is reality, and if you're a scientist, a natural one or not, you damn well better take into account the factors that impinge upon the problem you are studying. I'm not going to develop it in great detail except to say there are also a lot of relations among these. Anxiety and dignity matter deeply, and the hungry season tends to come up a lot as people's description of why they're leaving. And oh, here it is, climate events. They're still there. They haven't disappeared, and they are important. They matter. But how do they matter? Let's sort of sort them out. They matter because they do affect productivity in the biophysical world. They matter because they affect international donors and the allocation of funds to adaptation rather than to reducing vulnerability. They matter because of the discourses that come in that feed into the anxieties and so forth. So through productivity, they can be part of the hungry season. So they are in there. You could simplify the model. There we go. It's much simpler if you just look at climate, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So this doesn't look like a very plausible model, the hazards model. This, to me, is inadequate. And I just wanted to add a postscript. I'm sorry I'm slightly over time. And the postscript might make me a lot over time if I get through it, but I'm going to try and do this quickly. So what does hazard analysis do? It places cause in the sky, right? God or nature, and perhaps in an anthropogenic sense in climate change. But it places it where responsibility is quite diffuse. It occludes cause in place that is on the ground. It can incorporate some vulnerable conditions, but does not see vulnerabilities as having cause, as needing to be explained, and it takes fragilities and vulnerabilities as a given, as fixed sort of factors, not as something with an origin. What does vulnerability analysis do? Now I'm going into advertisement mode, right? It does all the good things. Now, it illustrates multiple causes in place. It illustrates contextual, structural layers of causality, that is root causes, causes of vulnerabilities, and causes of their causes. Multiple scales, multiple institutions, histories, and structural causality. It illustrates social cause to the presence, cause of the presence, really, or lack of climate proofing, that is protections. Now, presence or lack is important because causality in this case can be actions not taken, and those are uniquely social. It takes social contracts as real, that is, as social facts, and illustrates where social contracts are upheld and broken via things done and not done. So it traces causes to social contracts and beyond that to agency. In short, it establishes social causality. Cause of damages and blame, basically, they lead to blame. Pure biophysical causes do not carry responsibility. They can't, unless you're Bruno Latour, in which case a banana can carry responsibility or a rock, but I don't find that too plausible. Social causes of vulnerability link to responsibility when traceable to agency. That is an important thing. That is causality in the law, Guido Calabresi's work, and this is linked to notions of shoulds. Those are the contracts I mentioned in law, custom, and convention. They are socially inscribed forms, right? morals, golden and platinum rules, ethics and morality, reflection, thought, the ability to ask yourself the question of whether you can live with what you have done or with your decisions. These are what are embedded in and guided by law, custom, and convention. And there are coulds, right? What could be? That is the ability, the possible, no should without could. So the biophysical analysis does tell us something about what we can do, right? But the should informs us about what we do with what we can do, how we deal with that. So in the last two very quick slides, cause and response or solutions, hazard models provide a biophysical solution of coulds. Social and multi-causal models provide a broader range of solution. More coulds, the coulds of the social and social facts that we can, in fact, manipulate and work with. Violent silences are generated by biophysical models that occlude the social. They erase social cause. Biophysical cause allows local actors to avoid blame, but in doing so, this is a kind of violence. How do activists choose causal models? Climate change advocates do it on the basis of the biophysical for attention to climate change. This is a reduction. It's, of course, very resume. They're interested in showing that climate change is a problem, and they should be. It's a good thing. Politicians might do it to avoid blame by pointing to the biophysical or to climate change. Social well-being advocates might do it on the basis of social and biophysical causality for the coulds that we might be able to intervene in to change well-being. Choice of models. Farmers choose to migrate. They choose within a structure, social and political economic histories of place and context. Natural and social scientists choose causal models as well within structures. Embedded in their causal models, embedded in their history of training, recursively derived from implied responsibility, guilt, and liability. And I think that this is to say that when you choose your model, if it points fingers of blame, you may, in fact, pull back and choose another model if those that it points to are those who fund you, or if it does not, in fact, show causality in ways that point the finger at the problem you are hoping to highlight, right? There's a recursive relation within the choice that people are making. Funding is another matter in this. In support of funder positions, people will choose specific models. I've, in fact, boiled this down because I went over time, but the last slide of them all, in short, is all climate disaster models are chosen on normative bases. Purposes of those who can do the choosing, natural scientists, social advocates, politicians, oil companies, whoever. Different models have different implications, and those implications have an effect on their choice, and they are chosen based on those implications. So choice matters as it indicates potential solutions. And by the way, the emphasis on choice comes to me after being in a political economic tradition that denied agency, right? The sort of structural political economic positions deny agency, but I think it's very important to bring it in. Agency within structure. So it indicates potential solutions, not to mention indicating potential response, ability, and responsibility. Agency and structure matter. Like Sahelian farmers, scientists make decisions on normative grounds within broader structural relations. Thank you. Those are some migrants who made it to New Jersey.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Well, we move from simplicity to complexity, but I think it really opens up for a number of questions about what we're doing, how we're doing it, the choices we make, and also how do we communicate to others as a researcher, to a practitioner, etc., etc. There is a short pause now where you can get coffee, tea, and possibly a biscuit, I'm not certain. We will meet back here at... So, I know quite a few of you, and I know that you can ask some very good questions, and I'm expecting those at different levels, different directions, different issues. But first, we have Nina Newberg-Sørensen, and I'm certain most of you know Nina, but she is a senior researcher here at DIIS, also a, what do we call it, an area coordinator or whatever. But as I mentioned in the introduction, we have these different disciplines, these different fields we're working in. I'm governance, decentralization, social contracts, social protection, that kind of stuff. Nina is migration, mobility. I'm certain you're also working with much more than that, but coming from there. And after Nina, it'll be Lily, who is coming from climate change. We hopefully have shaped each other's thinking. Hopefully we have developed a frame which we all work in, but that's for you to judge as well. So please, Nina, if you would like to come with 5 to 10 minutes max
5
comments.
I hope
Okay,
will
thank
do.
you.
Am I on? Do you hear me? Yep.
Competition outside,
Yeah,
but
no,
I don't
I
think
know.
there's anything we can do about that. I'm not certain.
Well, first of all, I mean, I wanted to thank Jesse Ribot for a very good lecture. I mean, it's when you talk about these complex issues, I think it's very difficult to illustrate, and I think you did a marvelous job. And I hope I will have a chance to look through the PowerPoint with more time, because I saw many very interesting arguments there. I was a bit struck by. I agree. I mean, I'm not going to sort of question your point of departure, but I was wondering. I mean, when you put the hazard analysis versus the vulnerability analysis as sort of nature versus social causality model, where do you put the political? It seemed to me that the political was perhaps included in the social model, but when you say that both lead to blame, both models lead to blame someone, right? I would say that sort of the blame of the larger political structures, and not just sort of the social issues, the social organization at village level, the political organization at village level, at regional level, at national level, and at international level, or at least Senegal EU relation level, would for me seem to be a very important way to take the analysis further. At some point, you said, no matter what, migration is damaging for those who don't make it and for their families at home. It's also damaging for the social structures that gets broken, and a lot of social contracts that presumably have worked better in some past, distant or more near. But I'm wondering whether the conditions under which people migrate is what is damaging more than anything else, and whether those presumably well-functioning social relations that were there prior to migration were necessarily good for everyone, necessarily good for young men in a context where older men make decisions, and I'm also wondering where women are in this picture. Yeah. Yeah, and the final, two more things. One thing is debt. I was really happy to see that debt was figuring in your analysis. And I work with similar issues, just in different places, and it looks very much like the same. But what we have found is that debt is very often the very trigger of migration. So this is sort of an open question. What did you find? What was the importance of debt in driving or circumscribing young people's migration from the areas where you have worked? Now, the last question, and I think that's at least for all of us who work with research and with policy communication and having dialogues with policymakers at different levels. I mean, what we grapple with is how do we communicate complexity, right? I mean, your models are extremely complex, and they need to be, because that's where we begin to see explanations that are not the ones we are given, we are told. But we also, on a daily basis, are confronted with people who want our knowledge to feed into processes. And I just wonder, I mean, how do we communicate these kinds of complexity, especially in an environment where evidence-based knowledge is required, and the evidence we can come up with is full of all these different detours that are necessary to get our message through. So I think I'll leave it there, but once again, thank you for a very, very enlightening talk.
Okay, I can see you're making notes, Jesse, so I'll let Lily proceed now, and then you'll get a short possibility to come with a couple of comments back to the comments, and then we'll move out into the audience. So please, Lily.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Jesse, for an excellent presentation. It was really interesting. I did try and turn it on. Thanks. It is unmuted. Say something. Yes, check. Good. So yes, so a few things just from, as Neil introduced, kind of a more climate perspective. Just in also kind of to discuss some of the things you brought up. I love that you brought up the issue of framing as you did. You know, for so many things that we're seeing going on in the world right now, climate becomes a very easy kind of explanation. And I think in terms of mobility and migration, that's very much the case. And I actually had, just to give a really also illustrative example of this, I was working on a case in Vietnam of sedentarization programs where people living on boats were then settled onto land as part of a government program. And this was argued to be because of climate change, to reduce risk from major storms, you know, living out on boats, that they were very exposed. And, you know, I found, I was out in these areas and talked to the people involved, both the government officials that were working on these programs and then the people affected. And I found lots of work that was being done on this. There was a UNDP report about how this was great in reducing climate risk. There was research going on, also, you know, looking at it as a climate adaptation initiative. But as soon as you really started digging into it, it was evident that this sedentarization of people living on boats had been going on for generations. And the people that were now living on boats and were being sedentarized, they had merely moved back onto the water because they had grown up basically in a government intervention where their parents had been settled onto land, and there simply wasn't room on these small plots that had been allocated at that time for the next generation to grow up, to establish their families, and in very poor communities without access to other land or the means to gain it. And so this, I mean, it just illustrates what happens. You frame it as a climate change adaptation intervention, and these international organizations look at it, nod yes, adaptation, researchers even look at it. It's an easy explanation, but it obscures so much. So it in this case obscured the causes of, why was it that they still were living on land, or weren't able to live on land, were out on the boats again. There was no question involved of their preferences. The processes around these, were also a question, but none of those discussions had been brought up. So climate change is often being used as a simpler explanation and justification for things. So this issue of framing, I think, is hugely important. And so I think that's, one of the really important points that came out of your talk. And then I think also this issue of multiple causes, I loved how you kind of mapped that out and showed us, in this case of Senegal, where exactly climate change figured in the multiple causalities and relationships in terms of mobility, in terms of hunger, you also mentioned. And I think we are right now in the GCM program looking at our cases of Ethiopia and Ghana with our colleagues. And I think what's evident is that it is hugely place-based. So, of course, this analysis that you made so nicely for us and the mapping is going to look so different from one place to another. So in Ghana, we're seeing, for example, a more clear role of climate coming in terms of mobility patterns, but it affects existing mobility patterns. So you're seeing new constellations, you're seeing new temporalities, so moving to maybe different places for different amounts of time. So it's also coming into an existing complexity and dynamism. Because, this idea that you take something, you assume that it's static, and then you analyze it from there, as you're talking about with these models, and that's very much not the case at all. So you have an existing very dynamic situation, and this is one more factor coming in and shifting things around a bit, and people navigate within that, both in relation to climate, the many other factors you outlined, the governance, interventions or relationships that we're also trying to bring out in this governing climate mobility research program. And so that is the reality of the situation. And then to take it on, you started talking also, Nina, when you take it to the policy level. And when you look at climate change, a lot of the interventions you're seeing beyond, I think it's really important to underline what is going on at local levels every day, where individuals, households, officials are all trying to deal with this and navigate within it. And beyond that, in these kind of informal ways, people are just trying to get by, they're just trying to do their jobs, and climate change has come into that and affected all of it. And then you have a series of very formal climate change interventions. When you look at those and you look at how those are financed, which is so important for who is deciding and how and who gets input, you're seeing that most of these are coming from the majority of the financing, about 40%, multilateral development banks, and also bilateral development programs. So that gives you an idea of who is involved in deciding these programs and at what level. And that's just to say, so one thing is, communicating complexity. But then it's a question of who we're communicating to and what's the system that this is being implemented within. And I think that already there you see that, it's a particular set of actors with a particular set of approaches. And that set of approaches and the systems that they're, kind of being programs in these systems are developed within are maybe not well suited to addressing the realities and the complexities that I think Jesse illustrated for us so well. And so I think there's this huge mismatch that we've of course been seeing in development for many years, and you're now seeing again also with climate change. And so I think the question then becomes, not only how we try to communicate this, but how we get to the root also of the responses, the problems with the responses and the struggles that, or the challenges that we have there.
Great. Jesse, I'll give you 5 minutes max for an initial response.
Okay.
And then it is out to the general audience.
Okay. Thank you, really, Lily and Nina, for your comments. And I forgot to thank you at the beginning for helping organize, to begin with, yesterday's event and today. just first, on Nina's comments, I just wanted to correct one thing. I do not think that no matter what, migration is damaging. I said vulnerability itself. But I agree with you fully that migration, how many people in this room live in the same country you were born in, right? I don't know, but I live in my country, but I have migrated all over the place. Migration is part of the human condition, it seems to me. And the part that makes it damaging are those conditions, usually imposed by governments, by people who do not want migrants. And even the narrative of climate refugee and climate migrant comes from the very political economic meaning of migrant in Europe and North America, where if you say climate change is going to cause migration, what you are saying is you're mobilizing the xenophobia of Europe and the United States about, oh my God, thousands and millions of black people are going to come across your border. You know, this is a sort of drawing on racism. Otherwise, it wouldn't have the weight that it does in mobilizing people to be against climate change. So there is a political economy behind that. And so for me, the political is in all of this, the choice of models. And it comes back even to what Lily, you were saying about, the transplanting people or moving them onto land. This is a political act, and it's not a new one. Sedentarization, in order to be able to tax people, is an old history, right? Pastoralists in the Sahel. So just to very quickly then, I think there's not that much more. I don't need 5 minutes. Vulnerability is the damaging thing. The where are the women? We looked at this specific boat and it was men. And we did interview some women, but we were basically tracing why did these men go. In this case, it is entirely men migrating. So the women did come into this in terms of family members suffering loss, having greater labor burdens when people left, having to sell animals and land when coerced because their children were captured in Libya and told they would be killed, and so they would have to send 200,000 CFA and the like. So they suffered in different ways, and the marriage issues and the that I brought up. So this would be a different study, but is obviously very important. And how to communicate. Complexly. I've done it in different ways, through films, through poetry, through humor, irony. I have an article called Humor, Irony, and Subordination, Democratic Decentralization Through a Camera's Lens. And when you begin to do film and literature-based communication to people, they immediately say, that's not what happened. Or that's exactly what happened to me. And then they begin telling you more stories. So it's a great research instrument as well. Lastly, on that, evidence-based knowledge. I hate that term. I don't know any knowledge that isn't evidence-based, or I don't know any research that isn't evidence-based. And if you ask people who say, we want evidence-based knowledge, I say, what isn't evidence-based knowledge? And basically, they'll tell you what isn't evidence-based knowledge is the social sciences. And so it's a way of excluding, it's part of the violent silence, the silent violence and violent silence that we're embedded in. Last point, who implements and these institutions? They are asking how to do certain things. They're not asking why. And the minute you get into why, it does point fingers at institutions. And I am reminded of something I mentioned yesterday, which was When I got into famine early warning systems in 1991, in a USAID meeting at Brown University, when I told them they had to take into account these political, economic, and social causes of granaries being low and of babies being thin, they said, we can't bring that up in Kenya. We'd be kicked out of the country. So that's part of the why they don't look at the why and focus on the how in a very myopic sense of catching the bodies before they hit the ground rather than stopping them from falling down.
Great. Now it's your turn. What I suggest is that we take 2 or 3 at a time, and then there's a chance to respond. And if there is something that Nina or Lily has said that you want to draw upon, please don't hesitate in directing questions there as well. We will need to use the microphone for those streaming so that they can hear your question. So please indicate if you have a question. Amanda?
Just trying out something. It's a little bit linked to Nina's question about the political. And thinking about the responsibility of those who are, use the word modeling or framing, and decisions that are resulting from that. But there's a sense, maybe you could just say a bit more about accountability. Who is facing whom? Who is responsible? I mean, we all say, I mean, I will be happy to say things about what I think the World Bank is doing about over-digitalization of ID documents, which is what I'm working on. The question being, where, and a bit about not just policy, but political confrontation, is what kinds of, I mean, not taking away from your making good films and so on, but where does the confrontation take place of those who are making decisions which don't take these things into account? What kind of accountability sits in authorities that have funding or have normative authority? It's more around that question of accountability. Why is that not challengeable enough? And how might one actually take that on, given all these things that you're saying?
Do we have another question at this point, or? Please, perhaps
Hi.
say your name and who you are, where you come
Yes.
from, please.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. My name is Anna. I'm working for the Danish Red Cross as a student assistant, not a practitioner. First of all, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I just want to take up the question from Lily upon this system and how it's whether it's well suited for this multifaceted context that you're talking about. So how we should respond to this analysis and include climate change in the response on the ground. Thanks.
Okay. Would you like to start with those two? Jesse?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. And who is responsible, right, is a big question. I'm talking about responsible in the sense of normative judgment of what are the ethics of responsibility, as in the golden rule, the platinum rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. That is the way in which action is judged, but you're asking who is the judge here. And Hannah Arendt would internalize the notion of the judge as in a moral decision about whether you could live with the decisions and the actions that you do, based on whatever tenets of do unto others or the like that you carry. But the question of accountability is really a big one. So why can you sit there saying to the emperor, yo, emperor, you don't have any clothes? Well, the reason is, and the emperor can say, so what? Or you're full of crap, because the emperor is the emperor. These are questions of hierarchy and power. And I do not study that so much. the question of accountability in that form. The person who does is Jonathan Fox, who has done remarkable work on the way in which alliances of interest between those involved in social movement and those within government who resonate with that or can benefit from it can lead to policy action, right? But I also think that it happens in many ways. There's a lot of resistance that goes on in the villages when the Forest Service comes in and does the scientific forestry and says, don't break branches, because that's deforestation when everybody knows it isn't. In fact, USAID and the World Bank required people in Niger to only use live trees for charcoal because dead trees don't grow back. Okay? I mean, the most absurd shit you ever heard in your life. And what they do is they resist. They go out and cut the dead trees because they know not only does it make better charcoal, but it doesn't cause as much damage. They also do things when the Forest Service comes in and plants trees, which they don't want because it looks like a claim. They uproot them at night in the middle of the night and plant them, leaves down, roots in the air, all the way along the road. It was a very nice scene in Tambacounda. So there are forms of resistance, everyday resistance, but that's a big question. And Anna, your question, how do you include climate change on the ground? I think empirically, as we investigate what people struggle with, we will see various ways in which climate might in fact come into their insecurity or their well-being in different ways, and we should act on that within the context of the broader set of factors that shape their security. I think that increasing people's security overall will increase their security in the face of climate variability and change, because if they have buffers for everyday events, those same buffers may be something they can use to cope with their situations. And I avoided the word adapt because I don't like that word. Adapt is forward-looking. You don't ask, why do people have to adapt? You ask, how do we adapt? You ask, why are people vulnerable? Causality, anterior. And adaptation is a somewhat problematic term, but I accept that it is in wide use and that it means assisting people to cope.
Fine. Espen, please. Wait for the microphone, please. And if you have a question, if you indicate, I'll make a note. Thank you.
Sorry, I have a cold. Thanks for... is it working? Thanks for a very interesting talk. I wonder whether your model of how climate change is influencing has become perhaps too simple. It was, of course, you are in a very dry area in West Africa, but it seems that it affected productivity, basically. But there is a lot of more dynamics to it. Here at DIIS, we worked with climate change and rural institutions a few years ago, where we did a lot of surveys in Southern Eastern Africa and also in Asia, where we saw that climate change had become a platform for political contestation at the local government level, that farmers react in a number of ways. They don't just say, this is climate, we can't do anything about it. They shift from crops to fruit trees. They invest in irrigation. There's a whole dynamics of more commercialization of agriculture. There's a rural labor market developing. There's a lot of investments in non-agricultural activities. There's a whole dynamics going on, and a lot of climate change is is on the political agenda at local government, whether there's in how they make decisions. So it's a bit more complicated than simply. It has more arrows, if so to say, than I could see in your in your form there. I think that's basically what I want to say.
Okay, thank you, Esben. I should say that you are a senior researcher at DIIS. I should have asked you to say that when you introduced yourself. But Francis, and then Adani, and if you could say where you are from.
So I'm Francis from Ghana, also working with governing climate mobility. I'm very much fascinated by your focus on the question why. And I think why is very much important when we take vulnerability as a concept to study whatever phenomenon we want to study. And I find that really very important in the context of the Upper West that we study now, that we try to ask why, under what conditions did you migrate? What vulnerability conditions did you migrate? But what I find more fascinating is that the vulnerability context is so much dynamic in the context of a hazard that I think many studies do not focus on. For example, we find that the vulnerability context can change very rapidly when people are hit by a hazard, and that the vulnerable households could easily get unvulnerable households into their condition. So when I focus on with the idea of social, what do you call it, social claims that Amartya Sen really talks much about, you see households depend so much on others in a very socially connected zone that sooner or later you find that those who were initially considered maybe by some mathematical calculation that they wouldn't be vulnerable, they were very resilient, soon get into the same zone. So I think you really help us to understand the complexities of explaining the nexus between climate and migration. And I think that it's very important that young scholars like myself take this into consideration. Yeah, thanks.
One more question, and then Adani, please introduce yourself. And
thank you very much. I am Adana from Ethiopia, so I'm here as a PhD fellow in GCM project. So my question was on the governance aspect and vulnerability. So I read your paper on climate change is not a problem and cause of adaptation and others. So I see that you are an expert on how governance is linked with this phenomena. So in those works, you have indicated that local government officials have certain role, but like I'm working on Ethiopia, local rural Ethiopia, so there we have a different governance contexts. So probably maybe in one aspect, I see the officials as an actor, not the institutions to a certain extent. So maybe if you can say a few things about the role of local institutions in shaping how people adapt or respond to climate change and even make decisions. This is one thing. And two, building on Francis' remark, like the issue of vulnerability. On your model, I see like, climate change impacts plus vulnerability leading to damage. But in certain instances, we see people with, relatively higher adaptive capacity being affected through time and losing that capacity. So like, what about the role of climate change impact itself on, bringing vulnerability? Because the question of who is vulnerable and who is also becoming vulnerable is an issue. I think maybe if you have some insight on that, I'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Jesse, please.
I will start with Adani's question because I do not say climate change impacts. I don't use the word because the word impact after climate change implies that the problem is caused by climate change, that it is an impact of climate change. But the question of the relation is a ratcheting down when people are in difficult conditions and vulnerable, and there is a climate event that leads to then triggers, as it were, losses, then people are in a worse off situation. In 1989, there was a very good article on ratcheting down by Smith, not Neil. I'm trying to remember. And there's this question is not new in the climate modeling literature. B.L. Turner also wrote about the inter-event reduction in well-being as leading to a kind of decline over time in security. So you're absolutely right that that's a factor. The role of local institutions is extremely important. In the case that I'm looking at in eastern Senegal, local elected officials did have projects that they were trying to shop around. They included things like caged chicken farming, which was required the putting in of wells to keep water in the area. It's a dry land and you're well fed. But there were expenses in setting it up. None of the donors were going for it. There was a big program that was for returned migrants to retain them in place, in which they were being trained to be tailors and auto mechanics in a place where there weren't that many dresses or coats to tailor and not many automobiles to fix, partly because 14% of the gross domestic product comes from remittances, and they were really training them to go back to Europe and have higher paying jobs through donor aid to prevent migration. So local government was pushed out of this despite having proposals. The local institutions played different roles. Imams tended to try and stop young people from going, to convince them not to go. Parents are also local authorities. Parents struggled with this because some parents had been pushing their children to go, but over the last 10 years, given the number of deaths, became fearful and were trying to stop them. So they play roles, but they can only play roles to the degree they have the authority to do so. And the Forest Service took away the authority of local governments to make decisions, despite that the decentralization law of 1996 puts it right in their hands over who has access to and control over forest production of charcoal, timber, hunting licenses and the like. And yet, so it's hard. You need power to have an ability to play a role in that local arena. Esben and Francis, I can't agree more. It is more complex. Esben and Francis, why under what conditions? Being important, yes. And the dynamic part, I think, is seen in the way in which the failure of interaid does not come into effect until the moment of crisis. So it's only when there is a dip in production and people need interaid, or during the hungry season, that suddenly you see that vulnerabilities are higher than they may have appeared. But that is still vulnerability. That condition was a pre-existing potential in the way I would analyze it. Yeah, those are a few responses.
Okay. Irene, please.
My name is Irene Nalon, Association of Development Researchers. It's not so much, my question is not so much related to the climate, but related to what you said, and I was so taken by the things you pointed out, that the people having migration and remittances sent back, they kind of develop a different class, you can almost say, a higher hierarchy. But then at the same time you point out that 8% have people who died, And what about the rest of them? They send back remittances, but it sounds as if they are all getting better off through the remittances. Or is it really so that people who come to Europe, if we take the point of view from European side, we would say people come here, they don't get jobs, they get very low-paid jobs. We know even on low-paid jobs you can send back money because you live on a very low level. But how does it look when you come back? Is it only something you imagine that it's better to have a migrant in the family to give you a higher status, or is it? Can you see it in your surveys? Thank you.
If there isn't another question, then I'm going to take convener's privilege and put a question myself, if that's okay.
Sure.
First, just a very brief observation from some field work we did recently in Ethiopia, and that was we were sitting in an office which had a very clear, at the local level in a town, which had a very clear policy which came from the national level, had persons appointed to carry out this policy, but had no resources whatsoever to implement any kind of program based upon that policy. And what they had to do was to go to local NGOs, often INGOs, and try to find a program they were willing to support, which in some way or other matched a little bit the policy they were meant to be implementing. Now, that's not a question, it's just a comment showing how, shall we say, knowledge and where it comes from, and often very different. In this case, one of the NGOs we visited was a Dutch foundation with a very specific line on Christianity, actually. But it's very interesting to see where local government, and that raises the issue of resources. But now I'm going to be completely unfair and put a policy casquette or hat on and refer a little bit to your case study on cotton and one of your diagrams, which they weren't there too long, but one of your models, and I pulled out of it 3 key dimensions which you raised. One was administrative corruption, a second was political exclusion, and the third was about market and value chains, as these being quite critical factors in creating situations where migration became a decision taken. Climate change possibly being one factor among many, but I was very interested to see that. And then pulling a little bit on Amanda's question about accountability. If I'm a policymaker, would I look at this and say, okay, we need to somehow or other improve the effectiveness of local government, making administrations less corrupt? We need to do this by promoting better representation, greater accountability of local politicians, but also accountability of local administrations to those they are meant to be serving, rather than hierarchically upwards, downwards. And do we somehow or other try to change the balance, the political balance as well as the economic balance in the economic value chains they find themselves in, so that cotton producers retain a greater percentage of the value of the product they create, that it's not the traders or the industry who are in the power. And all these link together, but are they a basis for actually suggesting a strong piece of policy advice to, for instance, Danida or to UNDP? Would it be something which captures both the complexity, the multidimensional nature of the causalities, but also be something which they might see as being doable? That's my question.
Well, I have worked for a long time on democratic decentralization issues. And in my earlier work on commodity chains as well, worked with the World Bank. And I did make recommendations that they listened to but did not use. And the basic situation being that the main issue is that markets are structured not naturally, they're not natural critters, by rules, policies, oligopsonies, and the like, that mean there's very little of the profits, which you saw in the charcoal market case, that are retained locally. The owner of the cotton company, who I've met several times, is also very wealthy. Now the question is, if you distributed all that wealth amongst all the people involved in cotton, would it raise their income 0.5% or 30%? And I don't know, but in charcoal, it would quadruple their income if you took out the intermediaries. But there are rules made so that charcoal makers cannot sell in the city because they don't have transport permits and they don't have licenses. And I mean, right up to those little charcoal piles between buildings, those people pay taxes to the municipal government for that little place where their charcoal is piled up. It's not outside of government. It's not informal. So yes, I think we need to do that. And secondly, on the democratic decentralization representation question, you find that where powers are devolved to local authorities, making them able to be responsive and accountable to, or held accountable by, local people, they're given they are in fact either made upwardly accountable, or the powers that have been transferred to them are diminished so much that they become meaningless. So you have the situation of empowered local authorities, elected authorities, that are made upward accountable by the rules of the use of the funds. You have to get into all the details of how that's done. Or you have these downwardly accountable, beautifully democratic local authorities with no power. Those seem to be the two choices. And you have to compare across many governments in many countries to see that's clearly about the interest of central government in maintaining a certain control over local authorities. So it is political, as are many of these decisions. And I would be proposing price fixing, for example, at a higher price at the producer price level. And that is a complicated thing. The World Bank wouldn't listen to me, you know? I tried, but they did listen and created some programs that did bring the income up. And I'm sorry, Arina, your question. Remittances are highly differentiated. Some people go and send nothing back. Some people go to Libya, don't get across to Europe, and they're too ashamed to come home for having failed to send anything back, which is why the 8% of disappearances, but the 2% of confirmed deaths. Many people disappear into the labor force in Libya because they simply cannot face returning home. It is seen as defeat. Some get across to Europe, but they're paid for by people who are already in Europe. They become indentured servants to those who brought them across and have to repay the debt of transit for several years, and so don't send remittances back. But even having someone who's known to be working in Europe and without remittances, you are at a higher status as a family in the village than somebody who has nobody in Europe. So it's complicated, like everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have the privilege of seeing the number of slides in this presentation. It says 55 of 64 slides.
Yes, but many of them are blanked out. They're not.
And I think we should also, are these your creations?
Yeah, go to the first slide that shows, or I think one slide down, yeah.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
all of you,
Those
for
are.
coming. Thank you for your questions. I hope you will follow what particularly the Governing Climate Mobility Program is doing. We have a website on the DIIS. Thank you to Nina. Thank you to Lily. Thank you for those students who have helped us organize this and those sitting behind who are streaming. And a very special thank you to Jesse. And I think we should give you a...
Thank you, Neil.